Okay, can people hear me now? Yeah, okay, good. So this is a very sort of preliminary paper. It's entitled, "What is Peacetime?" ? And it's problematic, it's very much work in progress, is that I'm trying to think through the implications of arguments that I and a lot of other thinkers writing on pacifism have previously made for an account of pacifism that I call ethico-political, and for how peace is conceptualized in such a pacifist politics. Now, I take feminist pacifism as exemplary of what I'm calling ethico-political pacifism, but it doesn't, of course, exhaust the category. And I suppose my sort of gurus, in a sense, for that thinking are people like Jane Addams, Sarah Ruddick, and Judith Butler, in terms of the theorists that I'm drawing on. I was looking through some work when preparing for this paper, and there's a very brief line in Ruddick's Maternal Thinking, in which she talks about us as all being inside war. And again, in Butler's work, she talks about how we are all mired in violence. And it's that way of thinking about our situation that I'm taking as the starting point for then trying to think about, well, what does that mean for what peacetime might be? So ethico-political pacifists, sometimes called pragmatic pacifists, just political pacifists, realistic pacifists, there's a whole range of terminology used. But these kinds of pacifists start from the understanding of war as a condition rather than as an act. So what does it mean to understand war as a condition? I take feminist pacifism as my sort of guide here, because I think it is distinguished by the depth and thoroughness of its account of war as a condition. For feminist theorists, war as a condition encompasses not only the political economy of war, the military-industrial complex, and the centrality of the modern state to war as an institution, but also the ways in which gendered relations of power are reproduced and justified, and in turn reproduce and justify war. As a lot of feminist scholarship has shown, gender is embedded in war, and war is embedded in gender, institutionally, practically, and discursively. Everyone will have noted how in the recent conflict in Ukraine, right at the beginning, women and children must flee, men between the ages of 18 and 16 must fight, a very, very traditional gendered script for what it means to be at war. But this operates not only in relation to particular wars. Our very conceptualization of war relies on gendered reference points, from the meaning of war itself to ideas and ideologies of state and nation, to notions of chivalry or the civilian. The gendered nature and effects of war permeate peacetime, everyday experiences of citizenship, labor, leisure, and family life. And they continue to constitute and police gender boundaries, whether or not political communities are engaged in episodes of collective violence, so outside of actual kinetic wars. What I think the feminist foregrounding of gender in relation to war demonstrates is that war lacks neat spatial and temporal boundaries required by a tool that can be picked up and put down, and that it continually overspills efforts to contain it conceptually. For example, if we look at someone like Sjoberg's examination of justice in the Iraq wars, she starts by opening up the question of when the war in Iraq, normally dated as 2003, started from a feminist perspective. And as she points out, if one takes account of the conflict and its aftermath in 1991, the first Gulf War, and the highly gendered effects of sanctions throughout the 1990s, it's difficult to maintain that the war started in 2003. And even more difficult to do things like apply just war criteria such as last resort or proportionality in a way that excludes consideration of everything that happened prior to 2003. Moreover, it's been well documented that many women are as or more physically and economically insecure in the aftermath of conflict than during it, from displaced women in peacekeeping zones liable to economic and sexual exploitation to domestic violence in the homes of traumatized returning combatants. So when do we say that the war ends for them? You know, how many decades hence are there going to be deaths and injuries in Ukrainian and Russian households from traumatized soldiers coming home who've kept weapons and so on and so forth? For feminists, war does not happen in a defined space of combat, but is fought in and through a variety of forums, from the state's encouragement of women to breed for the good of the nation, to differential evaluation of aggression in feminized or masculinized children, to eligibility or otherwise for conscription. In this respect, feminist analysis has never been able to contain the idea of war as only to do with the state or the public sphere, and has always been open to how the concept of war bleeds into other categories. So as feminist and as pacifist, feminist pacifism is a collective political project dedicated to the transformation of a world in which structures, practices and discourses of gender and of war are mutually reinforcing, so transforming that situation. In this respect, as with other pacifist movements and traditions of thought, feminist pacifism is, I think, both absolute in its commitments and profoundly this worldly. And I think negotiating that absoluteness of the commitment and the this worldliness of the analysis is precisely the kind of problematic that I'm trying to engage with here. In recognizing the immanent relation between who we are as political actors and the constitutive condition of war, feminist pacifism is forced to grapple with the complexity and messiness of how we produce and are produced by war, and to challenge war across all of its dimensions, from the construction of individual and collective identities to the political economy of the development of weapon systems and so on. So analytically, feminist pacifism and other versions of ethico-political pacifism, I want to say, rest on an understanding of war as a complex, multiply constitutive material and discursive condition that persistently leaks beyond temporal, spatial and conceptual boundaries that people try to put on it. So far, so good. In this respect, you could say that feminist pacifism is in tune with a lot of work in critical war and security studies, which has also opened up the concept of war beyond traditional instrumental thinking, in which war is seen primarily as a tool by which to get certain kinds of political tasks done, or the focus on kinetic war, the point at which actual fighting with weapons is going on. As many scholars in war and security studies have pointed out, the prerequisites for war encompass much that goes beyond the battlefield, and the contours of war are continually changing. For example, relationships previously taken for granted between war and policing or war and the state are shifting in ways that are not compatible with a narrow instrumental understanding of war. But this opening up of the concept of war, which I'm suggesting is coming out of critical war and security studies and is inherent within the analyses of ethico-political pacifism, specifically feminist pacifism, raises challenges for conceptualizing peace. What happens to the concept of peace, and what happens to the pacifism part of feminist pacifism when war is recognized to be fluid and all-pervasive, and the lines between peace and war are no longer very easy to draw? Now, one place to look for answers is in the discipline of peace studies. Most of us will be familiar with Galton's distinction between negative and positive peace, for example. And it's interesting that in parallel with the ways that critical scholars have opened up the concept of war, we've also seen in critical peace studies a similar opening up of the concept of peace, in particular in the context of critical engagement with peacekeeping and peacemaking, as they have been understood and practiced in terms of the so-called liberal peace. So if you look at, say, a recent publication like the edited collection that I think some of the people on the call may be familiar with, by Alexander Hinton, or edited by Alexander Hinton, Giorgio Shani and Jeremiah Alberg, Rethinking Peace, Discourse, Memory, Translation and Dialogue, which is, I think, in some ways typical of certain moves within critical thinking about peace. The editors argue against trends in peace studies of various kinds, notably the tendency to reify peace as a static thing, something that we can somehow achieve and that then is just there. They also argue against inserting peacemaking and peacekeeping into any kind of linear teleology governed by normative ends identified with a certain package of institutions and rights. And here we go back to the fairly familiar critique of the liberal peace and the highly Eurocentric narrative that it's embedded on. I would say that they also try to move away from the negative positive peace distinction, seeing the former as bound up with the liberal peace. So peace on the negative account is simply the absence of kinetic violence. But also they're criticizing positive peace, seeing the idea of positive peace is in some sense perhaps being an unhelpfully utopian conception in which peace and justice become equated. And for that very reason, peace always seems to be something that we never get to. It's a kind of end of history thinking potentially. So I think even that notion of positive peace, which has done a lot of work for critical thinkers, is being criticized in this more recent work from peace studies scholars. Instead, in different ways, these scholars argue that peace in zones of conflict, in the aftermath of kinetic phases of conflict, so at the times that we often see as to do with, you know, post-conflict settlements of various kinds, and in the context of the kind of slow violence that Matthias was talking about yesterday, where you get very complicated and long temporal kind of connections between, as it were, perpetrators and effects, as in ecological effects of what actors have been doing. That in those kinds of contexts, peace needs to be thought of as a process, a building of non-violent relationships through a variety of everyday and private, as well as public actions, sometimes involving speech, sometimes involving silence, including processes of commemoration and artistic practice, such as we were talking to some extent about yesterday. The point here is that this way of trying to think about peace as a set of practices that are highly contextualized and that we find particularly vividly exemplified within situations either of kinetic conflict or the aftermath of kinetic conflict. This way of thinking about peace is one that doesn't understand non-violence strategically or tactically, but instead understands non-violence as a kind of quality of human interaction. So what's going on in these practices that the various authors contributing to the Hinton et al. Volume, I think, is trying to point to ways in which, even in what seem to be the most adverse circumstances, different kinds of relationships can be built between people and between communities than those that simply affirm the pervasive sort of war logics in which people have been caught. So it's not that non-violence is a way towards something else, it's that within the action itself, you are building something that is qualitatively non-violent. This more bottom-up way of thinking about peace articulates peace as imminent to conflict rather than transcending of it. And these kinds of arguments are, I think, disruptive of quite a lot of prevailing understandings of peace, a kind of common sense understanding in which peace is seen as some kind of continuum which is interrupted by war and violence, but also of the standard negative positive peace distinctions. So I think what we find if we look at critical war and security studies and if we look at critical scholarship on peace, all of these bodies of literature, as does feminist pacifism and ethico-political pacifism in general, rejects clear-cut distinctions between war and peace and the linear and determinate ways in which they've traditionally been temporally and spatially framed. But this leaves us with a puzzle in terms of pacifism as a political project. If peace is imminent to, as opposed to transcendent of war, and war and violence are everywhere, then how are the spaces and times of peace to be recognized, nurtured, sustained, and struggled for? How do we make a link between contemporary moments, one might say, of peacetime and the future without falling back into some of the teleological traps that I think have been very well kind of explained by scholars trying to think about it in this way, think about war in this conceptually more inclusive way, but also think about peace in that way as well. So this is, for me, then, the key question for pacifism as a political project. How do we make a link between contemporary moments of peacetime and the future without falling back into teleological traps? Pacifist struggle encompasses many possibilities: campaigning against political instances of organised political violence, campaigning for international modes of conflict resolution, publicly affirming pacifism in war and peace, witnessing of various kinds, contemplative activism, artistic production, conscientious objection, non-violent modes of protest from strikes through to civil disobedience, campaigning against the arms trade, anti-nuclear activism, setting up communities organised on principles antithetical to a militarised state system. All of those things. It also includes commitment to subvert the ways in which war operates as a matrix for the generation of meaning and value, whether in confirming the link between citizenship and arms bearing, legitimising the militarisation of policing, or reinforcing gendered hierarchies through the production of accounts of what it means to be a hero. So if we take that very broad agenda for pacifist acting and thinking, how do we then understand peacetime within that very, very complicated story? And I want to suggest that there are three temporal models that we tend to find at work in discussions of pacifism. And I'm kind of intrigued by Richard's presentation, because I think, again, some of these different temporal models were at work in what he was saying. So, I mean, one temporal model does want to think about pacifism in terms of strategic time, in which pacifist non-violent strategies are identified as the best ways of achieving various kinds of objectives, whether it's peace or justice, or, you know, however one wants to formulate it, or even things like stopping terrorism or stopping the buildup of arms. Now, that way of thinking, in some ways, I think, is out of step with the critical work on war and peace that I've been talking about. On the other hand, it does enable political planning and political action in ways that are clearly present in pacifist activism. So it does seem to me that that is a temporality that is at work and can't therefore simply be rejected. A second temporality is where pacifism is thought of in terms of as a kind of exemplary peacetime, so that pacifist action or pacifist exemplars, in a sense, represent peace in the now, or bring the future into the now. And here I'm relying quite heavily on Uri Gordon's work, who I think showed really well these different ways of thinking about prefigurative politics. Now, one of the things Gordon suggests is that if we think about pacifism in terms of exemplary time, of somehow enacting the future of peace within the present, then there is a danger of that smuggling back universalism into thinking about peace and assuming there's a kind of Archimedean point of view or a particular trajectory to history, which again seems to cut against the critical insights about war and peace that I started with. But at the same time, again, it's clear that exemplary politics has and does play an important part in pacifist thought and action. Particular figures such as Tolstoy or Gandhi or King, collective action, the Women of Green in Common, for example, there are many, many more examples, of course, form part of collective imaginaries of what pacifism means, and they inspire and they shape pacifist politics. So again, that temporality, in spite of its problems, does seem to be part of how pacifism works. A third temporality, which has perhaps been less investigated, relates, I think, to the second form of prefigurative politics that Uri Gordon talks about, where he talks about the possibility, understanding the temporality of prefigurative politics as in some sense generating new time, actively changing political relationships in the world, as opposed to being either an instrument or a prefiguration of change. And that does seem to fit better with some of the critical scholarship that I was talking about earlier. But it also ties pacifism perhaps to a kind of presentism and contextualism that might constrain more ambitious and inclusive aims for pacifism. I do think, though, that that is the direction in which some of this recent work that I've been talking about, discussing the pervasiveness of war and the mutual imbrication of war and peace, seems to point. And I think what that's asking for, amongst other things, is a much more thorough democratizing and provincializing of pacifist imaginations. So just to conclude, perhaps the only answer we can offer to the question, what is peacetime, is that it can only be time that we make and remake across all of the aspects of the ways we live, think, and struggle, especially where that living, thinking, and struggling is in the eye of the storm of war and violence. If peace and war are always intimately connected, then we learn most from the points of connection in which the agonism of their relationship is most acutely lived and most acutely resisted. Peacetime is constructed in the push against martial modes of relation, wherever they are encountered. It's never a settled state, but always an ongoing struggle. And I will leave it there.